So hello and welcome to the National Adaptation Forum webinar hosted by EcoAdapt. This webinar is the online convening of the adaptation community between biennial National Adaptation Forum events. Visit the National Adaptation Forum website to learn about past fora, including our most recent gathering this past April 2019. We are beginning to plan for the 2021 forum, so please stay tuned for more information as details unfold. I'm Molly Johnson, one of the National Adaptation Forum organizers, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Today, as part one of our summer webinar rewind series, we will be revisiting a rapid vulnerability assessment tool recorded in 2017. Before we get started, I would like to go through some housekeeping rules to ensure a successful webinar. So please place your telephone, cell phone, or computer on mute. This will help reduce feedback. If you are using microphone or voice over IP option, please ensure you place your computer on mute, even if you are listed as muted when logged in. We will have time for question and answer after the presentation. So throughout the webinar, you can use the question function to submit questions to presenters. We will do our best to answer all of them. You can also type the questions in the chat box for us to pull from. Please use the chat function to report any technical issues or problems you might be encountering. We will try our best to help you address any problems to ensure you have a favorable webinar experience. The chat function can also be used to communicate between attendees as a way to emphasize a point heard during the presentation. We encourage you to engage with your fellow colleagues that way. We will be recording and posting the webinar in the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for future viewing. The webinar should be available online next week and can be viewed at cakex.org. The presentation will also be available online as PDF in the EcoAdapt site, ecoadapt.org/webinars. So much of this webinar will consist of replaying the webinar recording from 2017. Sound for this video will only be available through your computer speakers. So keep in mind that if you called in via your phone, you will not be able to hear this portion unless you turn on your computer speakers. Once again, if you have any, we'll reach out to us via the chat box and we will do our best to resolve any issues. Additionally, we wanted you to be aware that certification maintenance, or CM credits, are available for the webinar today through the American Planning Association. You can evaluate the session through the CM search on the APA website. And please contact us if you have any questions. So I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter for the webinar, Eric Mielbrecht from EcoAdapt. He is the Directing Scientist and Director of Operations with EcoAdapt and is a co-founder of EcoAdapt. He specializes in assessing anthropogenic stresses and the risks they pose in natural and built environments. He is particularly interested in bridging gaps between research, decision-making processes, and action, all with strong stakeholder involvement. Eric also wears the Operations Director hat at EcoAdapt and helps with the work that needs to get done to get the work done. However, he is occasionally let out of the office and plays a key role in climate change vulnerability assessment processes and stakeholder workshop facilitation and doing other helpful things. And we also have, the webinar will also feature presenters from 2017, including Lucy Robideau from Commission for Environmental Cooperation, Carol Berthnall from Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, and Laura Hansen from EcoAdapt. So with that said, I'll let Eric take it away.
Thank you very much, Molly, for that kind and informative introduction. It's good to be back and sharing this information with all of you again. I do want to take a minute or two here at the beginning before we do a run back of almost 2 years now to some work we've done with the Commission for Environmental Cooperation in collaboration with other stakeholders. But right now, I want to bring your attention to something that's soon to be released. This is a continuation on what you will be learning about with the recorded video and discussion afterwards. And that is the Climate Adaptation Toolkit for Marine and Coastal Protected Areas. This builds on the work we had done with the Commission for Environmental Cooperation and with their support after we developed the Rapid Vulnerability Assessment tool. And stakeholders were learning from that process that coming up with and deriving adaptation strategies that were specific to their needs was a complicated process that needed a bit more support. And so we continued work to build this toolkit, which has within it a whole assemblage of things to make the whole climate vulnerability assessment, adaptation strategy development, and implementation process more supported for marine and coastal protected areas. This is going to be an online toolkit. It has 4 and a couple more components to it, but I want to draw your attention to these. First is the Rapid Vulnerability Assessment tool. So the tool you're going to be learning about today in this webinar actually sits within this online resource, and which also provides context to that. But the major outputs for this toolkit are the adaptation actions table and search, where we have compiled hundreds and hundreds of adaptation actions that connect specifically to vulnerabilities and climate responses that occur in ecosystem or habitat types that are in coastal and marine protected areas. So very easy way to go through and find, I'm very concerned about beach erosion. I'm very concerned about intertidal and the stress of water temperature changes in the future. And you can connect those two responses to and adaptation actions that are then backed up with a couple at least case studies of what people have been doing to address those stresses, and possibly some tools that can help support that. So it's a great addition to it. There's also a section in this online resource of, including foundational resources, which is really a survey of what are the most current and useful resources around vulnerability assessment work and adaptation strategy development in coastal marine protected areas. And we're also developing and building out a list of experts that have kindly volunteered a little bit of their time to support processes. So you can search them based on their expertise or their regional locations that may be adjacent to where you're working. And I should also bring up that this toolkit focuses, and the resources that you are going to be learning about today, focus on all of North America. So Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So there are case studies and examples and processes from those 3 countries, which broadens the resource pool. So where is it and when will it be released? It will live within the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange. It's a set of topic pages within that. And keep an eye on your email. If you've registered for this webinar, then we have your email. We'll be doing a public release for this in the next month or so. And then we'll be doing a much larger introductory webinar to this resource in September. And we hope you will come back for that. So with that, I think we now move into the video. Again, the video itself has been edited down from originally over an hour long before, so it might be jumpy here and there. And the first person you hear speaking on the video, I believe, is Lucy Rubidoux from the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, giving a bit of introduction of their programmatic context for this work. So stay tuned for the video. We'll have questions afterward, and I'm happy to address those and some questions about the new online tool we're building if they're raised, and we'll talk to you about how to bring questions to the whole group afterwards. And one more reminder is if you're having trouble hearing the sound on the video, the webinar technology only allows the sound when we're playing videos to come through your speaker. You're connected to your computer and not your phone, so you just have to switch over to your computer speakers to hear the video. So with that, take it away, Molly, with the video. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I'm quite pleased to be here today to present the great work that we did with our many partners to develop the Marine Protected Area Rapid Vulnerability Assessment tool. So I'm the head of the Ecosystems Unit at the Commission for Environmental Cooperation. And in this first part of the presentation, I will focus on why and how we created this tool. So the CC, the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, is the intergovernmental organization that supports the governments of Canada, Mexico, and the United States, working together on their shared North American environment. So a key part of our work as an organization is really to facilitate collaboration so that we can address environmental issues on a North American scale. So what we do is we bring experts from the 3 countries together to share, provide knowledge and recommendations, to develop tools and training, and to promote best practices across the continent. A good part of our work is delivered through 2-year trilateral projects. Next slide, please. So this slide gives you an idea of the kind of projects that we work on. This is the plan that we just closed in July last year, the 2-year plan. So our projects range on anything from forest carbon through food waste, blue carbon to clean energy. Each one of these projects is designed by experts, managers, what we call steering committee members from the 3 countries to address specific needs that they have identified, with the CC being the best way to accomplish this work. So as you can see on that, there's an example of the 16 projects here, and the last one on the lower right corner is very relevant to us because it shows our work on marine conservation. For this and every other publication that I will mention, all of this is available on our website, and many of these are also available on the new NAMPAM website, typically in the 3 languages, at minimum in English and in Spanish, with at least a summary in French, and it's there for you to use, download, and share with everybody who think will benefit from it. So that's my spiel for sending you to our website. Moving along, of course, as part of our last project cycle, the 3 countries, through the lead agencies, identified the need to strengthen the management of marine protected areas and the resilience of their associated communities in the context of climate change. So the project builds on ocean connectivity, and it aimed to strengthen the management and resilience, and also looking at it across, having an approach across sister sites, so that we are looking in effect at at seascapes, or part of the North American seascape, so that we can not only share knowledge, but have, if possible, coordinated action. Next slide, please. So as a first step of the project, we brought experts together from the 3 countries in San Francisco in January of 2016. So the project experts and partners identified there a need for a similar but more rapid tool that they could use to get insight into the likely impact of climate change on their marine protected areas, and also to help them prioritize actions. And of course, ultimately with a goal of increasing both ecosystem and local community resilience. So from that initial discussion at the meeting, we agreed that we would develop a common tool for rapid assessment of marine coastal habitat vulnerability, and that could be applied at various scales, and that the tool would also be piloted with the regionally grouped sites, so that we could, of course, create as strong a tool as possible. So we agreed to work on two internationally shared seascapes, the Pacific Northwest, that's with Olympic Coast and Pacific Rim, and the North Central Coast, and that is Isla de Guadalupe and El Vizcaíno in Mexico, and the Channel Islands in the US. So to do this work, we put out the request for proposal, and this way found the consultants, EcoAdapt, and explained to them that we wanted a user-friendly tool for marine protected areas practitioners to evaluate rapidly, and by rapidly we meant 2 days, the implications of climate change on selected habitat. So we found EcoAdapt, a very enthusiastic group of consultants who wanted to first make sure that we were actually were going to take this seriously and not just make a tool that would be that would not quite lead to optimal results. And we had a very good startup conversations, understood we're on the right page, the same page, and started working on this. So EcoAdapt initially researched and developed a first draft RVA, and then gave a webinar on that tool so that everybody could have an idea where this was going before we can then pilot the tool. So the tool was piloted in the 2 seascapes that we saw before in Pacific Northwest and the Central Coast and Islands. And it was refined through those processes as well as following the webinar, but more extensively, I would say, through the piloting of, through the application workshop. And now those 2 boxes on the right there say that the tool was refined and then it was published. There were still many steps in there, but that's the gist of it. So again, this is just another view of the process. So from the initial draft and the webinar and the pilot, we went and really worked hard on developing the vulnerability assessment in a manner that was not only including everything that everybody wanted in it, but also that was user-friendly and helpful to the ultimate goal of supporting the managers. So it basically, I think through the exercise itself is almost a product as well. People got to know each other, people got to work together. We saw various approaches and I guess very, to me, interesting questions as to the relative weight and importance of social and ecological factors. And we ended up with a tool that is simple, that is focused, that is feasible and flexible so that people can do use it as they wish. And the main goal, of course, is to bring the MPA to be as climate adapted as possible. I'll pass the floor to you, Eric.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucy, for that that context for the whole process. My section here is going to focus on a very rapid overview of this process, going through this methodology. You know, how it works, what it looks like, and where to find it. And again, it is the product is a methodology, so this is just a blinding kind of speed through that. Download these resources, and the instructions are there. The detailed process on how to undertake this yourself are there. So I'm just going to show you the pictures, talk a little bit about the linearity and non-linearity of it. But I do want to bring your attention to the bottom right-hand corner of the next set of slides, which is a shortened URL for where you can find these resources. The overall process, again, is you're undertaking this, is it gets you from these, the state of kind of your questions and concerns about, you know, how climate change could be impacting your work, your vision and goals. The example we work specifically is in marine systems. And so that's what this built around, but it's very flexible, can be adapted to be used in all kinds of systems. And then hopefully to bring you to this place where you have then derived some informed and implementable adaptation strategies. So, you know, what is a rapid vulnerability assessment? I think Lucy talked a little bit about this. I'm sure most people in the audience today are familiar with climate change vulnerability assessment processes. They can be large and very detailed, depending on what their initial goals are and what the Commission for Environmental Cooperation and many other folks we've learned along the way really saw a value was to do this in a quick way to get folks started without a whole lot of resources and cost and a whole lot of technical expertise. How do you begin a process like this?
So RVA process is, simple, focus on your interest, feasible to undertake with what you have on hand and with the people you have on hand, and creates a product that you can get started implementing and using, which is really the bottom goal. What do you need to do this, to go through this process? Of course, you need the tools themselves, so please do download them if you haven't already. Obviously, have some curiosity and interest in learning how climate change is affecting what you do. You need some knowledge on the site or the systems being evaluated, and that can be through your team, your experts you may have on staff already, or some folks you may be able to bring into the room for this process. You need some awareness of kind of what the climate impacts may be in your region. You don't need, extensive downscale modeling or anything like that. And to some degree, most of these climate information is available through local agencies, government agencies at the state or regional level, even through local universities. So look for your local climate information hub. You can find usually most of that information. And then, of course, a day or two to do this. And you can get through it in 2 days very successfully. Another important component of this is who to involve in the process. Obviously, you want to engage as many as possible. And I alluded to some of these folks already. But you really want to be all-inclusive in this process, because the more collaborative you are, the better the outcomes will be, and the better you may be, or the coalition may be, actually implementing adaptation strategies at the end. Okay, now I want to get into the meat of the process a little bit. And again, I was alluding to folks in the audience who are most likely familiar with a standard vulnerability assessment model. This is one we pulled from the IPCC documents. It's been around for a few decades at this point. And those are the, you'll see these kind of keywords in there like exposure, sensitivity, combining to be kind of a potential impact. You will then consider potential impact with adaptive capacity to establish a relative vulnerability for that system or that component of that system. And the rapid vulnerability assessment model, we've simplified this a little bit by looking at likelihood and consequences around climate in your systems to combine for an overall climate risk. You combine that with, or consider that with an adaptive capacity again of your local components of your system, and consider, and then combine that into what may be a relative vulnerability for that part of your system. Okay, steps. This is a 5-step process. I'm going to take you very quickly through these 5 steps and introduce you to some of the, the visuals or the tables you will see in these products. But step 1 is defining the scope of your vulnerability assessment. This is step 1 to many processes, because the goal of this is to define that scope, list out some initial parameters, and kind of focus your work. So I identify some habitats or components of your system you want to consider, some of the climate change variables you're interested in, some of the other things that may be going on the ground around these climate change issues, so relative non-climate stressors, and of course a time scale from what you're interested into the future that's more related to your management planning horizons. And you don't have to create these out of scratch. The nice thing about this RVA tool is it's pre-populated with a lot of different ideas. So in these tables and boxes, are a lot of components that help get you thinking about this. In some cases, these overlap well. The tool is written for marine systems, so a lot of those are considered, given the west coast of North America. May not be appropriate everywhere, but if you're looking in a system that's completely different, like a terrestrial forested system, these pre-populated will not necessarily work so well, but you obviously get an idea of what you can put in there. Components of your habitat, different species populations you may be interested in, the different non-climate stresses in your region, that are appropriate for your own assessment. So going box 1, 2, 3, and 4, you were looking at what habitat types. Box 2, what time scales you're interested in. Box 3, what are the climate change variables you are considering or worried about in your area. And of course, box 4, what are those non-climate stressors going for. With this initial information, you can begin to dig in. So steps 2 and 3 are really kind of building the structure and filling out the matrices and then running through the process of completing the matrices. Step 2 is you set your priorities. We begin to transfer that information from step 1 into the worksheets. Step 3 is actually undertaking the assessment. So step 3 is kind of the meat of the process, which will get you all the way down to a relative vulnerability for the different components of your site. So again, this is using your local knowledge, using the people in the room with you to actually work through these worksheets together. So tables 1 and 2 and 3, again, are kind of the core to the process. So table 1 looks at the vulnerability assessment process. This was actually the summary table that you'll take from beginning to end. You start with your climate stress for your habitat and the time scale is identified. Climate stress on the left, you will work that through all the way to a relative vulnerability for that habitat type or system component that you're most interested in. Table 2 is, and tables 2 and table 3 feed back into table 1 in different places. So table 2, again, looking at a habitat type and a time scale, lets you look at the non-climate type stresses. Table 1 incorporates the climate stresses, table 2 incorporates the non-climate stresses, and then in table 2 also gives you a chance to consider how climate may affect those non-climate stresses. So it is kind of iterative, and climate, it runs throughout. Table 3, again, gets that last component of vulnerability, which is adaptive capacity. This is the one that we got a lot of feedback from our different testing groups on how best to capture this concept. And with a lot of really good thinking in multiple trial settings, we kind of divided this adaptive capacity concept into 2 categories: an ecological potential for the system and a social potential for the system. And so from an ecological potential point of view, we looked at how ecosystems are functioning, how diverse are they, how connected are they. From a social potential point of view, we looked at what is the potential or capacity of the management agencies or organizations who are in charge of those resources. How responsive may they be? How sophisticated are the staff? And then we look at the management potential about, is there legal and other structure in place there to get that done? So this is a nice way to kind of summarize these issues. We have kind of a semi-quantitative scoring through this, which is directed through the methodology, and lets you combine all these factors into a final average at the bottom, which then feeds back into table 1, one of the columns of table 1. Okay, so after you've completed step 3, which takes you all the way through to a relative vulnerability score, you begin step 4, which is developing adaptation strategies. Again, in the same context with the same group, after you have identified vulnerabilities, the highest, or if you choose, the most vulnerable systems, you will go through and build on, work on developing adaptation strategies. And again, there's a worksheet set for doing both of these, one for strategy development and one for strategy implementation. Last but not least is getting a final output from this. So, of course, you need to be able to document this process. You have your worksheet processes, but final step is also to build a narrative around that supports those processes, so you can kind of explain this. The worksheets themselves, or the products themselves, include kind of a Mad Libs approach to this to give you an idea about how to do this. So interspersed within this methodology, some things I've totally skipped in the overview I've just done, and there's some nice techniques and ways to score and compute relative vulnerabilities. We have 2 components, a risk component and a vulnerability component, which you actually score through the process. And I'm just putting up here to introduce some of the terminology we use, some of the matrices we use to help compute some of these scores throughout. And you'll see in the methodology descriptions of how best to use these. But I'd like to say, some of the tougher parts of this process have been eased through some of these techniques we developed. Okay, again, drawing your attention to the 3 products together, available at this URL down here, if you haven't written down already. So again, just in conclusion, I did a very quick overview of the process, kind of jumped around through that. So do read through these. The guidance or user guide is only about 38 pages long. It's very approachable and very easy to get through. So I hope I've piqued your curiosity in this. And I will hand this over to Carol, who's a sanctuary superintendent at Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, and she will talk a little bit about her experience in working with this. Thank you, Carol.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to the CEC and EcoAdapt for the work and supporting this initiative. So Olympic Coast was one of the 2 pilot sites that we had a collaboration with our Canadian counterparts last year. And so what I want to do is give you a little bit of context for the area that we were working in, and then I'll talk about some of my observations. We are part of a network of marine protected areas managed by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. You can see the map that shows all 14 of those. I'm up there in the northwestern corner, Olympic Coast. And the mission of the sanctuary program is to protect these places in the Great Lakes and the ocean. And it's really to have a thriving system of marine protected areas that protects these areas and also inspires momentum for a healthy ocean. So we're kind of taking a long-term look at these places and using them in some cases as laboratories to test some of these management concepts. Climate change is an issue that affects every single sanctuary, and so we really needed to develop a cost-effective way to both understand the issue and think about what we can do in terms of management. And so what we were very interested for Olympic Coast was serving as one of these test locations. It's a 3,189 square mile marine protected area. You can see from the map that it goes up to the boundary with Canada. So Pacific Rim Marine Park to the north of us is affected by the same ecosystem as we are. So it was a great opportunity to work with them. In looking at some of the issues that affect the sanctuary back in 2011, we identified climate change as a really key topic, and we were interested in how we could do a better job of both understanding the issue and thinking about what are our options for management. The other thing that I will say is a great advantage for sanctuaries is that they have these programmatic approaches that include research, so understanding what's happening in the area, education and outreach, so we can take that information and then work with coastal communities so they have an understanding and hopefully can support some of the management actions that are proposed. We also, each sanctuary has what's called a Sanctuary Advisory Council, which is made up of the different interest groups, tribes, state, federal agencies. So that gives us a great forum to be able to discuss these issues and think through together how do we approach it. So I wanted to give you a visual image of Olympic Coast because it has some really challenging feasibility issues. It is essentially a wilderness coastline with very limited road access. We overlap with Olympic National Park for 60 miles of coast, and all of those areas are under what's called a wilderness designation, which means that there is an emphasis on not having a lot of human intrusion into that, including for management. So it created some kind of unique challenges for us as we thought through how far can we go in some of these management strategies. We also have a very strong relationship with the 4 coastal tribes that have usual and custom areas in every single inch of the sanctuary. And they have a very strong interest in understanding climate change, both from how it affects their treaty protected resources, but also how it affects the infrastructure on the coast, because most of these are coastal communities at sea level. And so they are definitely feeling the effects of climate change in terms of increasing sea level, increasing storminess. So in many cases, they're actually relocating their villages uphill. So understanding what the effects of climate change are on those coastal communities is very, very important for them. We were very fortunate in that we have done a lot of background work on what the impact of climate change will be on the Olympic coast. Back in 2013, we commissioned a report that brought together 26 different experts to help us think through what will be the impact on physical processes related to climate change, what will be the impact on habitat, and what will be the impact potentially on different species of concern for the next 50 to 100 years. And so I would say that our rapid vulnerability assessment was really greatly informed by this very robust information base. Without it, it would have been quite abstract, I have to say. And I'm not going to go through all these, but these are kind of the physical processes that we believe are at play right now and will be for the next 50 to 100 years. This report is available on the website if you want to take a look at it, but it really helped inform our work. And as it turned out, we were able to also have the author of this report participate on our rapid vulnerability assessment team. So it included representatives from Washington Sea Grant, Olympic National Park, Washington State Department of Natural Resources, and the sanctuary staff. So we were all able to go up to Victoria and participate in this. We went through the training. We actually did a bunch of pre-work before the workshop, and we met after the workshop as well. So I think 1 to 2 days might be a little optimistic, but it depends how deep you go into these issues. So the assessment we did, and it wasn't comprehensive, but we looked at 5 different habitat types. And those included rocky intertidal cobble beaches and mixed cobble sand beaches, kelp forest, so kind of the nearshore habitat. And then we also included what became a very challenging habitat type, which was pelagic offshore. And that was the one that kind of made us scratch our heads the hardest, I think, on some of these climate change trajectories and impacts. So we went through the rapid vulnerability assessment, came back, did our report. It honestly took us 3 or 4 days to kind of work through all that. And then what I'd like to do is just give you kind of my observations on the tool, and then talk a little bit about how we see using this in the future. So I do really think this was a great approach to do these 2 pilots, adapt the methodology based on actual doing of it. But what we really need to do now, if we're going to use this, is to actually go through what I call the full McCoy, which is to really get all the affected parties in the room, the tribes, the resource managers, and the scientists to go through this in a real approach. The other thing I would really say is this is very scalable based on what information you have available. It's unlikely that you are going to have detailed information on all habitats and physical processes, so you're going to have to make some inferences from other things, and that's okay. There is a bit of a trade-off, I will say, between this rapid approach and a more intensive methodology, and it is challenging to find the right mix. Scientists tend to want to go really deep. Managers want the answer fairly quickly because they've got to make decisions. And so finding the confidence between those 2 groups in terms of doing what is a good enough assessment that you can actually make management decisions on is a bit of a challenge. I think we found a decent mix with this approach, but it'll be interesting to see as it gets applied more what the kind of report card on that is. It is absolutely critical that you have an interdisciplinary group and a diverse group, because we found that even amongst the scientists, we've really had to talk through some of these issues before we felt comfortable with the ratings that we came up with. So I think having a full complement of people at the table is absolutely critical. The other thing that we found was that the complexity of the adaptation and mitigation strategies really increased as you went offshore. And I think part of this is just based on there's been a decent amount of work done in the nearshore habitat, but what do you do when you get into these offshore areas? And that's where it became increasingly difficult for us to come up with what we felt like were feasible options. And the last point on this slide I will say is that feasibility in a wilderness coastline like the one we have is really challenging, because just getting to some of these places is not easy to do. And the cost becomes quite prohibitive if you're looking at some larger scale approaches for mitigation and adaptation. I really do believe that we're going to have to learn as we go in terms of the feasibility of some of these adaptation and mitigation strategies. So having an adaptation loop, if you will, where you try something, you monitor, you learn from it, you change it, you tweak it a little bit, is going to be absolutely critical. And there is I observed quite a bit of variability among our team as to how experimental they want it to get. And finally, one of the things that really came to me was doing nothing is not an option. We are at a very critical time with a lot of these issues, and we don't have a lot more time. We really got to get going on applying this. So what's next for Olympic Coast? We have been working with EcoAdapt to seek funding to conduct a more full assessment. I'm really interested in additional work with CEC to help refine the toolbox of marine adaptation strategies, in particular for these offshore areas, because I feel like that needs a lot more work. And finally, I am really interested in participating in a learning network of MPA practitioners as they attempt to apply some of these, and so that we can learn from each other, and not everybody has to figure it out in each individual location, but we can share some of our experiences kind of across the spectrum that will help us all be more effective at this.
Thanks, Carol. That was great to hear your observations. And I think we definitely have more work to do within the sanctuary program on how we can, as you noted, find the right mix between rapid and kind of more exhaustive assessments. So Carol discussed her experience in using the tool as part of our pilot workshops. But once the tool was actually released and was finalized this fall, I was able to take it over to Gray's Reef National Marine Sanctuary and apply it there over a 2-day workshop. First of all, just to give acknowledgement, this is kind of the project team. It certainly wasn't just me doing this. I had support from headquarters and the sites and a couple folks on detail to the sanctuaries from other line offices. And so Gray's Reef, just so you know what I'm talking about here, it's off the coast of Georgia, about 26 kilometers off the coast of Georgia, especially compared to some of the protected areas, the sanctuaries out here on the West Coast. It's pretty small, 8 by 6 kilometers. And Gray's Reef really protects this beautifully diverse live bottom reef. You'll see here there's just a carpet of sponges and tunicates, a very high rugosity surface for fish and sea turtles and all kinds of marine organisms. And so it's very important but patchy habitat off the coast of Georgia there. Next slide. And Gray's Reef National Marine Sanctuary, about 2/3 of it, there are restrictions on anchoring, collecting, some fishing, discharge, explosives, and construction. And then I think 1/3 of the sanctuary is actually completely closed to fishing and diving, and it's just a research area so that they can look at the impacts of fishing. And it's very important to have a diversity of participants at your workshop. So we did a lot of work in advance to make sure we had the right people at the table, and I think we did. It was a really great workshop. These are the participants here. We had a bunch of federal NOAA folks, as well as National Park Service. We had some state agencies, the Department of Natural Resources from both South Carolina and Georgia. We actually had 2 academics from University of Georgia, as well as Georgia Southern. I forgot to put them there. And a couple NGOs from Pew Charitable Trust and the Nature Conservancy. So it was a great mix of people. Next slide. And so we basically, in a 2-day workshop, I will note we had a pre-workshop webinar, which I would encourage anytime this tool is used, just so that once you get everybody in the room, you can really hit the ground running. And so we had a webinar where we actually walked all the participants through the tool, so they're already familiar with it. They could have their questions answered. I did end up doing some alterations to some of the worksheets because this tool was designed to assess habitats, and the staff at Gray's Reef really wanted to just assess species. So we had to make a few modifications really just to the adaptive capacity section to make those questions apply specifically to species rather than habitats. But the bulk of the workshop, folks worked in 3 different groups to assess. They ended up assessing 9 different species. And this is really the more important slide, is takeaways and feedback. And so just in the green box there, we had some interesting takeaways. looking across all the species, we found that for Gray's Reef, increased storms and increased sea surface temperature were really the two very critical climate stressors for Gray's Reef. And that's one of the things I love about doing these vulnerability assessments, is to find the commonalities, because that's pretty straightforward for an offshore reef. That storm activity and temperature would probably be what you're most concerned about, but it's not always clear until you do this type of assessment and you can look across resources and see what's kind of rising to the surface. We also were able to identify opportunities for further collaboration in the region, including some education initiatives, proactive management of the invasive lionfish. They realized that they don't do any post-storm damage assessment to inform some of their management actions as related to increased storm activity, so that came up as a big need. And then enhanced communication up the coast, as they expect species ranges to shift further up the coast. It was really great to, even though we were working with the final RVA tool, I still really consider this a pilot, at least for the sanctuary program, because we did make changes after piloting it at Olympic Coast and the other sites, and this was really the first time that we used it full on in a real setting with a brand new group of people that had not had any input prior to this. And so this group did end up providing some feedback as to how the tool could be improved and how the process for future application at other sanctuary sites could be improved. We did a quick little survey with them afterwards in that pink box and asked them 3 questions. Was the workshop a good use of your time? How effective was the RVA tool in assessing vulnerability to climate change for your management unit? And then what was the efficacy of all the introductory material, the pre-workshop webinar and the presentations? And you can see got pretty high scores there on a scale of 1 to 5 from the participants that filled this out. And then lastly, I just wanted to highlight these 2 quotes from a couple of our participants. One said that the workshop was so valuable that she hopes to use what she's learned during the process at her agency. And this other quote says, the meeting was effective, adaptation strategies have been proposed, and all of this work will help Gray's Reef engage in climate science, illustrating climate effects on sanctuary resources, and potentially raising awareness of these issues with stakeholders. I could see the value of the process repeating at other sanctuaries. Thanks for a productive meeting. So I think this really shows, having taken this tool to the opposite coast of the country, that they were really able to use it without too much trouble. I was there as the facilitator, and it was a pretty easy job for me. I didn't have to do too much hand-holding, and so I think that speaks to the tool and the user guide, that it is pretty easy to use, and they felt like it was pretty effective, at least in getting these conversations started and working as a launching point for further assessments and work. So with that, I think we have 1 minute for you, Laura.
I just wanted to point out that this RVA was designed for marine protected areas. However, I have subsequently modified it and used it beyond marine protected areas. I've been using it in the Strong, Prosperous, and Resilient Communities Challenge project that's working with 6 cities. We have already tested it in Atlanta, and we've made only fairly minor modifications. So on that initial step, well, there's actually further examples of how we changed it, but the major change is that the Spark project looks at climate, health, and equity. And so we just changed the choices on the initial page for the climate and the non-climate stressors to be more specific to those interest areas as opposed to MPA habitat. Pretty simple change, and then we modified a little bit of the text in the other tables. But again, it was easily adopted by those users. And like with Sarah's example at Gray's Reef, we had a fairly diverse cohort of participants representing local government, NGOs, community groups, and local academicians. And we're able to move forward with a little bit of a changed plan. Next slide, please. We didn't use the Mad Libs version, we used the massive whiteboard version, and as a group mapped out 4 different sectors working interactions between them and came up with this sort of engaged piece.
Thank you for watching that video, and I did just want to add that I did miss a speaker in the beginning, so I want to recognize Sarah Hutto for her presentation as well in that recording. So now we will be taking questions from everyone. And I will let Eric add anything that he wants to share with the group.
Molly, can you hear me?
It's a little cloudy sounding for me, Eric.
Okay, how about that? Is that better?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about the little delay there. Yes, thank you. So again, you saw a recording of a webinar that was presented back in December of 2017. I do apologize that the links that were in that to the resources are, given the ever-changing state of the web, out of date. So I've included on the question slide here the 2 ways you can access those resources. The bit.ly link here is case sensitive. It links you back to the Commission for Environmental Cooperation's library for these resources, where they have the 3 components of it, which is each a user guide, worksheets, and completed worksheets in 3 different languages. The primary language is English. It's also been translated to Spanish and French for use in the 3 different countries and around the world. Again, you can also access the resources on the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange by just typing in Rapid Vulnerability Assessment Tool in the search box at kcax.org, and you will pop up not only the tools themselves, but links to this webinar as it was recorded back in December of 2017 and other case studies and uses of the tool. And again, any questions, please type into the chat box, and then our moderators will relay that out for everyone. I'm happy to address those.
Okay, Eric, let's start out with this question from Heidi. Could the RVA tool be used for resilience planning for the built environment?
That's a good tool. And a good question, Heidi. And I think it can be. The process can be. You will have to do some homework beforehand, preparing beforehand to update the worksheets to include the components that you're interested in within the built environment. It is developed now. The habitat types that are listed in there are like beaches and dunes, cliffs and rocky shore, rocky intertidal, et cetera, et cetera. You could change that to very specific components of the built environment in which you are interested in working with your stakeholders and addressing. The non-climate stressors, again, you probably have to switch around to be more appropriate to that. The climate stresses, what probably are, you can do a subset of those or even add a few at the end, but they're fairly universal in that point of view. And you can certainly use that, the same structure and approach, and just follow through that. But I think preparing ahead of time an updated set of worksheets to bring to your stakeholder and working group to work with would be the best approach to do that. Great. Any other questions out there?
Yeah, another question is, what other resources are out there to support a rapid vulnerability assessment?
There are, I mean, as you know, if you can go through just searching something on the web and finding rapid vulnerability assessment or vulnerability assessment tools, there are a component of them out there. There's a classic one that was written a few years ago called Scanning the Conservation Horizon, which is really a comprehensive assessment guidance tool around vulnerability, assessing vulnerability in natural resource situations, and is used in many places already. And so there's good documentation of its use and case studies of its use. An extension of the project that this webinar was based on in the Rapid Vulnerability Assessment tool for North American marine protected areas, the work that EcoAdapt has been doing in collaboration with the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, also the Greater Farallones Association, is to develop the Climate Adaptation Toolkit for Marine and Coastal Protected Areas, which is the online resource which I introduced at the very beginning of the webinar here. And that's going to be going live in the next month or so. And that, again, has a context of resources that really expand on and support, or expand on the support of developing adaptation strategies. So once you have identified your vulnerabilities through the rapid vulnerability assessment tools, what are some of the ways to approach those vulnerabilities and make them, make this context around them more resilient and reduce those vulnerabilities. And that's what this tool is going to do, be a strong resource to support. And again, I will keep an eye on your email. An announcement should be going out in the next month or so, making that available. And again, encourage you to use that tool. I do reiterate that is for marine and coastal protected areas specifically, but it can also give just general ideas around how do you deal with sea level rise, how do you deal with temperature increases, how do you deal with water temperature changes, etc. So it's a good resource to go to. It'll be emerging fairly soon. Any other questions?
Yeah, one more.
Great.
This question is, let me quickly read it. I wanted to know if you're using any other information other than the IPCC assessment reports and the scenarios therein for the detailed vulnerability assessment.
That's a good question around a more comprehensive approach. And as the RVA tools user guide brings up in the process, you do have to have at your hands a reliable set of climate change information for your region that's appropriate for the habitats or resources in which you want to assess the vulnerability of. That I think is the other part. And that can vary depending on where you are in the world and your region. They're good, resources through local universities and research groups. Good resources through the climate adaptation and science centers that the U.S. government still has up and running. For coastal regions, also NOAA. NOAA has great resources about coastal climate change impacts and data sets that are useful for assessing impacts to your resources. And just begin to ask around, look for some of those reports. Carol, in her discussion of the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, talks about a report they commissioned several years ago that's specifically looking at what does climate change look like in their region, and going through some of the specific components of that are helpful for them in assessing vulnerability. So those kind of reports are out there at a regional and sometimes a more local scale to assess, to access and use in a vulnerability assessment process.
Great.
And again,
thank you so much, Eric.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
was going to say,
Okay.
as I'm answering these questions, as you've typed in the box, I'm not quite getting to an answer you're looking for. Just reiterate the question or just ask a more specific angle of it, so I can hopefully address questions directly. And also, you can reach me via email at Eric, ERIC, at ecoadapt.org, and I'm happy to take questions offline to support this too. Go ahead, Molly.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Eric, for joining us today. And it was nice to do this little flashback with you, and exciting to hear that there's going to be a toolkit released in the next month. So we will definitely be passing along any remaining questions to you, and you can answer them via email to people. And I wanted to say thank you to the listeners for joining us today. And please pass along that anyone who couldn't join us today can find this recording at the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, or CAKE, and through cakex.org. And you'll be able to find a bunch of other resources on there as well, including the link that we posted in the chat box to the Rapid Vulnerability Assessment tool itself. And so also we will be having other parts to our Summer Rewind series, including the replay of the importance of traditional ecological knowledge and adaptation planning on August 8th, as well as the replay of building climate resilience by connecting to health on August 22nd. And you can find more information about those on our website, nationaladaptationforum.org, and you'll see the link to those webinars. And then our National Adaptation webinar series are run quarterly. So if you would like to recommend a topic or are interested in partnering with us on co-hosting a webinar, please email us at info@nationaladaptationforum.org. And on behalf of EcoAdapt, Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.